In this video, we're going to be talking about thinking and composing. What we'll be doing is applying a psychological model of thinking to help us compose music. So, when you're engaged in any creative activity, you've always got to answer the question, what am I going to do now? This is especially true for music. In particular, when the music you're playing isn't fully notated. Sometimes when you're inspired, everything just happens. Everything falls into place and you just do it. But sometimes you're just not inspired. Sometimes when you're working with other people, you find that what you intuitively do isn't what they intuitively want. So you've got to come up with something different. Sometimes you might just be in a rut. Everything you do sounds the same. You need to break out of that pattern. And sometimes you just don't even have a clue, don't know where to start, and you're completely lost. So essentially, anytime you're in a creativity on demand situation, there's always a possibility that you can get stuck for ideas. One way to get things going again when you get stuck is to zoom out and take in a more abstract perspective. What we can do, we can look at musical composition as having two distinct phases. One is generating basic music material, and then the other is assembling this into a larger structure. And the thinking model we're going to talk about naturally reflects this type of compositional process. So when we're stuck, a good tool to help us is the thinking model heuristic, which was developed by an educational psychologist called Dennis Sale. Dennis developed this tool to help people engage in effective thinking when they solve problems. While this is not specifically aimed at music creation, it naturally lends itself to that getting stuck with composing problem. Dennis Sale defines thinking as the conscious and goal-directed mental activity that we do in order to solve problems. Our musical problem is, what should we do now? What should the music do now? Dennis breaks thinking into 6 distinct types. And this is one of his slides. We can see an oval shape in the middle with metacognition and the various other types of thinking all linking into it. The key to the thinking model is to engage in metacognition. Meta means referring to itself. Cognition means conscious mental processes. So, metacognition is essentially thinking about thinking. When we engage in metacognition, we are aware that we're thinking in a planned manner, actively thinking about the ways in which we are thinking, and monitoring and evaluating how effective we are thinking. So, if we are solving some musical problem, we need some way of knowing if we've got a suitable solution. So that means evaluation. We need to know what we're looking for. So we will need some criteria. And then once we've got criteria, we can generate different possibilities and test them against this criteria and see if we think it's suitable. Sometimes the criteria are really fuzzy and purely subjective, like I like it or not, or it creates the mood that I'm looking for or not, or it's too busy or not, or it's too noisy or not, or it speaks to me or not, plus many other ones. Sometimes, though, the criteria can be very specific and technical, but it will still have a subjective element to it. And these criteria may relate to what is idiomatic in a particular style, or it may relate to how hard it is to actually play, or it may relate to the physics of sound and how humans hear, or it may relate to some high-level compositional attributes. Some sorts of high-level composition attributes include things like the trajectory of the piece, how fast we're presenting new information, how much repetition there is, how much contrast there is, if we got a climax, if we got points of reference, overall balance, what's the foreground, what's the middle ground, all those sorts of things, which we'll look at. Once we've got criteria, we need to generate possibilities. Typically, we'll want to generate many possibilities, and we'll want to generate different types of possibilities, and hopefully there'll be novel possibilities that we haven't heard before. It's interesting to note that historical research has shown that to get quality, we need to generate lots and lots of options to choose from. In some way, producing a quantity of options helps us achieve better quality. Essentially, when we're generating possibilities in music, we've either got to come up with something out of nothing, or we could get something that we've got and transform it into something else. Some ways people get something out of nothing is to use imitation. We get some model and then we bend it or break it or blend a bunch of different things together to make something which is kind of like imitating the original but is different. Sometimes we'll just sit down at our keyboard or our guitar or whatever and we'll just improvise and come up with stuff. Sometimes we use idiomatic heuristic approaches. What does that mean? Well, if you're playing a bass, for example, you might do something like that sort of thing if it was a country song, or you might go if it was a rock song, or you might go if it was a ballad. So different types of genres might have different sorts of common practices, so we can apply them. Sometimes we'll make things out of fingering patterns. Sometimes we can make things out of complex formal processes called formalisms. Some of these have got randomness in it, which are called stochastic processes, or we can map non-musical material to musical parameters like pitch and duration and come up with things. Sometimes we're just walking down the road and we get an idea. Often when we're doing things, our unconscious will come up with stuff. And then when it comes into our conscious mind, we should take a note of it. So that's why some people walk around with notepads. Now, what about transforming something into something else? This is a very specific sort of technique. This is when we take some musical material and then we transform it. Like we might play, then we might play, then. So I took the same little 3-note progression and then transposed them up. Or I could do an inversion. There are lots of processes we can apply to a bunch of notes to create a new musical idea. Once we've got some options and we've got some criteria, then we need to work out if the criteria is met. To do that, we'll need to do some sort of analysis. In general terms, analysis allows us to identify the relationship of the parts to the whole structure. Or we could identify the function of each part. Or we could identify what would happen if that part wasn't there. Or we could look at how we can collect different parts together to form subsystems. Or we can look at how 2 or more parts may work together to have some sort of synergistic effect. So we're going to use analysis to look at the structure of the musical material that we've generated. And there are lots of ways of doing this. We can look at it from the perspective of timbre. We can look at it from the perspective of time organization. We can look at it from the perspective of texture, and we can look at it from the perspective of how we organize the pitch. There are lots of ways. So, once we've got an analysis, we can compare our different possibilities and see which one would better meet our criteria. When we compare and contrast, what we're doing is we're seeing what's similar, what's different, and what's important about these similarities and differences. And in some situations, certain features will be applicable, and in others, they won't be. An extension of this analysis idea is to work out if there are any specific things that a particular possibility may be particularly suited for. This is looking at any inferences that the option may have. So, in general terms, inference allows us to make meaningful information out of the data available. It enables us to identify causal relationships. It can identify key points and emphasis, and it can help us make predictions as to what will happen in the future. Now, in music, different possibilities can lend themselves to different things. If I was to play this, that might lend itself to being a pad. If I was to play this, that might lend itself to being a bass. Sometimes musical material lends itself to particular situations. For example, this sounds like a beginning. It doesn't really sound like an end. This sounds like an end. So, by using metacognition to help us break our musical problem down, then that can help us come up with ideas more effectively.